Alright, let me forewarn what will be discussed and will not be discussed. Even though we are touching on Marcia Lucas and her comments on the sequel trilogy, that's not the main subject. I'm interested more in how Star Wars is related to Dune. And for those completely new to the debate, essentially, there's been a big controversy among Dune fans. I fall in the camp that most of it was stolen. I'm sure a few ideas were legitimately inspired, but basically, George Lucas stole the story. That's my opinion, but I'll try to be open minded in terms of particulars. I'm not really interested in what Marcia has to say about Star Wars per se, although I'll deal with that in due time in other places, and I'll link the videos when those are done. I'm more interested in how the framing is done by some Star Wars fans. So we're going to listen to Robothead, as it's pretty obvious he hates the sequels. But he also says he doesn't like the prequels. What I don't like is how he's framing things that JJ is a bad director and the sequel trilogy is really, really bad. But George Lucas is a genius and he's really, really good and he's very original. But I'm not going to speak for him. We're going to let him speak for himself.
George Lucas's plans for the sequels would be just thrown in the bin and ignored. A businessman, an assistant, and a guy that's only ever copied other films his whole career made the decision to ignore one of the greatest storytellers of all time. From that moment on, we're all doomed to these fucking shit films.
Salt.
Marcia also had a few things to say about the prequels. I know this because 2 seconds after posting the original quote about the sequels, the Twitter lunatics' heads started exploding and the abuse started flowing. Everything from just, I was a general asshole, to I was lying and having some huge cover-up, and somehow this had something to do with what she thought of the prequels. A quote about the prequels that I didn't even know existed at the time. The sequel defenders think if they bring up something bad from the prequels, it makes their films better. I never understand that. Anyway, Marcia said about the Phantom Menace, I cried because I didn't think it was very good. I thought he had such a rich vein to mine, a rich palette to tell stories with. He had all those characters. And I thought it was weird that the story was about this little boy who looked like he was 6 years old. But then later on he's supposed to get with this princess. He looked like she was 20 years old. Sadly for the weirdo that was doing his best to uncover some scheme for me to lie and cover up the truth. I agree with Marcia on the prequels as well. And a lot of people did. I didn't think this was news to anyone. And I think most people agree the reason that Phantom Menace isn't great is because Marcia wasn't around to keep George in line.
She didn't like the prequels either. So why don't you post the rest of what she said? Then post the prequel quotes and I'll call it a day. Because you like to mislead your audience because you know they like this shit up. You want to mislead people to get the clicks and the dollar signs. I can't help that you're a lying bag of BS. They doesn't give a rat's ass about any of you unless you're just as sad and hateful as them because he's intentionally withholding this piece of information. Be sure to include her thoughts on the prequels.
It's fine, gentlemen.
JJ is bad because he steals from other films to make his own films. So basically, he has no creativity. But Lucas, if he did the sequel trilogy, would be very good because he's the greatest storyteller of all time. Well, I find it very hard to say that this guy is the greatest storyteller of all time, much less a good storyteller if most of the story is stolen from somebody else. Now, Frank Herbert is on the record that when he saw Star Wars, he was shocked at how many parallels there were to his story. And to be fair, Frank has not been entirely consistent. Sometimes he acknowledged this and had a good sense of humor about it. Other times he was very, very angry. Now, ultimately, as far as I know, officially, they never sued George Lucas, but he did say on the record he did think legal action was permissible, and he was seriously thinking about it. And I gotta be honest, given how much wealth George Lucas made from basically Frank Herbert's ideas, again, a lot of this money is owed to Frank Herbert and his family. Frank Herbert did really basically conceive almost the entirety of Star Wars, its basic foundation, its structural myths, even key moments, key tropes, almost everything that defines Star Wars. The Messiah in the desert, fighting an evil empire, finding out the villain is related to the hero. Every major aspect in Star Wars shows up in Dune, but in Dune, it's much, much more complex. It's much more complicated than it is in Star Wars. Now, again, in artistic affairs, whether film, novels, or TV, it's going to happen. You're going to borrow, you're going to pay homage, you're going to reconstruct material from somebody else. I can't deny I do that as well. And it's very tricky, both legally and ethically, to say when somebody goes too far. And I understand a lot of Star Wars fans legitimately think that, well, yes, Lucas was inspired, but it is his story, even though clearly a lot of it is influenced by Dune. I do respect that opinion to some degree. So I think with somebody like Anomaly Inc., even though his video on this issue was also really, really terrible and never brought up Dune, he actually loves the prequels as well as the original trilogy. He even loves the prequels more than the original trilogy. So at least he, I don't think this is a good thing, but he is a 100% fanatic about George Lucas. He just is devoted to George Lucas. But Robothead says, no, I don't like the prequels either. I actually agree with Marcia. They're not very good films. So, okay. You don't have the excuse that you're a complete George Lucas fanatic, so you're saying he's the greatest storyteller. The prequels are bad, but the sequels are terrible because why? They're bad because they're too derivative. They're taken from other people's ideas. George Lucas would have been much more original and creative. Well, him stealing and quote borrowing a lot from Dune disproves that there just is not a lot of creativity or originality in George Lucas. I think my assessment would be this: George Lucas is a very uneven writer, but he's not a complete hack. As a director, he's much better. He has some interesting editing choices. He's very devoted to experimental film. And he does have a lot of interesting moments in the original trilogy and the prequels. But in terms of this subject, almost everything you're attributing to Lucas is really from Frank Herbert. So your phony parallel between J.J. the Hack and George Lucas, the great storyteller, is never substantiated. And we're going to do more on this because this is a very tough, very difficult subject in terms of how much can Frank Herbert be credited for Star Wars. I think it's going to be a very high percentage. I would say literally about 85% of Star Wars is just Dune. It's very superficial changes that Lucas made from the Frank Herbert story. Now, whether legally anything will ever happen, that's one question. But in terms of the ethics and as well as just being truthful, so I don't think we can entirely avoid the subject. It is a legitimate topic to be debated. What I find shocking is he doesn't even address the issue. He's like, oh, maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. Apparently, he doesn't even know. So he honestly thinks George Lucas really did create Star Wars, apparently all by himself. And this is a pervasive opinion among Star Wars fans, even though more and more articles and more media is showing that, yeah, Dune is the central core of Star Wars. There's still just a lot of denial among Star Wars fans. And I get it. You know, he's a clickbait propagandist idiot. I don't take him too seriously, but unfortunately, I think this is very common where people just want to deny the history of how much Dune is in Star Wars and just want to sort of say, let's forget about that, or, it's mostly inspired, or like, no, we're not going to play that game. I think for the most part, he stole it. If you think this is somehow compatible, he can be the greatest storyteller of all time, but he stole most of his, quote, own story. Well, that's you. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's logically coherent. That's not empirically true, and I think we can show, no, clearly he stole and borrowed immense amounts of, quote, his story from somebody else's story. So how could he be a great storyteller if all he's doing is telling somebody else's story? That doesn't make any sense to me, but that's me. So again, interesting comments by Marcia on the sequels and prequels, but it's more alarming how Star Wars fans are once again framing it as a sequels versus prequels debate, and Frank Herbert is magically not being mentioned again, and this kind of silence really needs to stop. Again, how each Dune fan is going to address this issue is up to them, because obviously many Dune fans don't care, or they know the parallel, but they're like, well, yeah, it is what it is, but, let's judge each work on its own terms and not become too obsessed over this, again, probable theft. I agree, but again, we shouldn't ignore it either, and that's where I stand. Thanks for listening.